Hi everybody. In this video we are going to discuss how we take an application that was originally designed for Oracle and move it to SQL Server. We're going to touch about the basic, the most common problems that you may run into and how to handle them. So we're going to create the SQL database. We're going to talk a bit about isolation level, and then we're going to talk about how to use tables that we're basing on row ID and what is the right equivalent in SQL Server. So here we are. This is my Northwind application, and this Northwind application has been using Oracle very happily for quite a while. And here it is running on Oracle with my data on Oracle. We can see that it's using Oracle because it was adding this row ID column here automatically. Now let's start talking about actually using SQL instead of Oracle. Well, the first thing one needs to consider, and actually consider quite carefully, is how to configure your database. So I'm going to go to the SQL Server Management Studio, and I'm going to add a new database, and I'm going to call it from Oracle. Great. Now, there is a very basic difference between the way Oracle manages transactions and MS SQL manages transactions, specifically by default. I'm going to make a long story short and tell you that in SQL Server, to get the exact same transaction behaviors, or at least the closest one to what it used to be in Oracle, you should use a transaction called read committed snapshot. So to change my database to read committed snapshot, I need to run this script. Alter database from Oracle, set read committed snapshot. And now my database will be ready to handle transaction in a way that is as close to Oracle as I can. This is really one of the big humps when moving from Oracle to SQL. You get blindsided by the way the transactions work differently. Great. Next thing you want to do, you want to define a connection to this database in our source code. So let's go ahead to our source code, and we're going to say here env data provider connection manager shared, and say add or Microsoft SQL database. This is actually what happens when you read the INI. When we read the INI, it calls these kinds of methods, but you don't have to read them from the INI. You can write them in your own code and get the values anywhere you want. So I'm going to give it a name, SQL Server. I'm going to give it the catalog name, which is from Oracle. This is the database that we've created over here from Oracle. And I'm going to give it a server name, in this case localhost. Obviously, read it from anywhere else and fix in the code, but for the demo, that's going to be close enough. And then I'm going to set the isolation level to read committed. Again, this is to handle the difference in transactions between the way Oracle uses them and SQL uses them. This one is essential. If you need a username and password, there's another overload to this method that also takes username and password. In this case, I don't need them because I'm using Windows authentication. Perfect. So now I have the connection added to my list. Now, I want my code to be able to handle both Oracle and SQL. Or you know something, let's just switch it to use SQL. So in my data source class, this is where we get the connections that is used by all our tables. Instead of returning Northwind, I'm going to return the same names that I've defined here, SQL Server. Perfect. So now when I run this, I will be using SQL Server. Okay, obviously I'll get an error saying invalid object name customers, but I can see in the details that I'm happily using SQL Server. Great. So this one is done. Next, let's talk about row ID, what happens with it, and what's the best way to handle it in SQL Server. The original code in many cases will have a table that inherits from Oracle entity. And then usually it will have this line over here, which actually tells it, use row ID as primary key. That means that whenever we issue an update statement or a delete statement, we'll be using the row ID to perform it. Let's dive into its code in env and see what it actually does. When we're going to use row ID as primary key, we can see here that we're defining a column called Oracle row ID. We are adding it to the column collection and are using it as our identity column. Okay? Simple as that. We're just adding a column automatically. Now, in SQL Server, you will not reuse row ID, but the best equivalent for row ID is an identity column. And you can actually see here that there's a flag in the Oracle entity class saying if we are migrated to MS SQL. Okay, let's go have a deeper look this code without a pick, so just be able to see it. Here we are in the class called the Oracle entity. It's in the file called Oracle connection wrapper. And in use row ID as primary key, we can see exactly how it is defined here. And then we have this nice little flag that we can use to actually generate the equivalent correct row ID in SQL Server that should be the equivalent to what there is in Oracle row ID. Okay, so let's go to migrated to MS SQL. We see there's a bool column that is by default set to false. Let's set it to true. Okay, so in our program, we're going to say env data Oracle entity dot migrated to MS SQL equals true. Okay, when we do that, instead of adding a row ID column to the table, okay, we have to generate the Microsoft SQL script. We can see here that there's a column called __ sequence big int identity. Okay, and by saying identity means that it will automatically increase by 1 whenever we want it. The database will take care of that for us, which is kind of similar to the way row ID works, because when we insert a row to Oracle, row ID gets generated for us. So here when we insert a row to SQL Server, well, the identity will be generated for us. Now in previous versions we used to call this one sequence. I actually don't like that name anymore. Let's go and change it. So if again we go to use row ID as primary key and go into row ID in SQL Server, we can see that it's just a number column, and we can change its number from sequence to underscore row ID. I'm just using underscore to avoid conflict. Perfect. So now when we run our code, we'll have the row ID column as we wanted it to be. Great. Now we can take this, run it in our SQL management. This table was successfully created. And if we'll enter it now, we can see that it exists. We can see that there is the underscore row ID column at the end. We'll start entering rows. Let's go ahead and enter new rows, which I'm probably missing something. So I'm going to say this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we can see that the row ID was incremented automatically for us. We didn't need to handle it. For example, just add over here 15, and we can see that it's incremented for us. So this is the best way we feel you should use a SQL Server when you're moving from Oracle to SQL Server. Simply get the set your row ID as primary key and adjust it to use SQL identity instead. Now, just a few more tweaks here to make this a bit more versatile. Since we set here the property of migrated to SQL, I would use the same property in our data sources and say if migrated to SQL return this connection, otherwise return the original connection. This actually gets me to a point where I can say my same application can run on Oracle or SQL based on this little flag to be tweaked and be read from some external source. And it works. Perfect. So let's review the changes that we've done here and what has happened here. We go to TeamViewer, to our version control, and have a look at the changes. In the Oracle connection class, okay, we've changed the name of the row ID in SQL Server from sequence to row ID. In the data sources class, we told it that if we're using SQL Server, simply get the connection called SQL Server. And in the program class, we added the connection that we wanted, and we've set the migrated to MS SQL flag. Hope this was enjoyable for you. If you need the source code for this demo, let us know and we'll send it to you. Have a lot of fun.